A man with nothing, no money, no name, no proud past, walks into a dying ranch in the midst of the harshest winter in prairie history. They call him a vagabond. They say he brings nothing but trouble. But while the entire valley prepares to bury Frost Creek Ranch under snow and oblivion, this man is the only thing standing between death and survival. This is the story of a man nobody wants and all that he saves. Like, comment where you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this story won't let you go until the end. The wagon came apart 3 miles outside of Frost Creek. Not all at once, it wasn't that merciful. The left rear wheel had been wobbling since morning, grinding against the axle with a sound like a bone trying to snap, but not quite making it. Caleb Rourke had heard it. He'd heard it for the better part of 2 days, actually, and he'd done what a man in his position does when he hears something going wrong and has no tools to fix it and nowhere to stop. He kept moving, and he hoped. He was still hoping when the wheel finally gave. The wagon lurched hard to the left, and Caleb heard his daughter cry out from the back before he could even react. He yanked the reins and got the horse stopped, but the damage was done. The axle had cracked clean through, and the left side of the wagon sat nearly flat against the frozen dirt road, tilted at an angle that made everything on board slide toward the ground. "Papa," Wyatt's voice from behind him. 7 years old, and already that voice had learned how to stay flat when things were bad. Not panicked, just asking. "I hear you." Caleb climbed down from the seat. His boots hit the road and he felt the cold come straight up through the leather. He hadn't had decent boots in 2 winters. "Stay where you are. Both of you." Lila was still crying. She was barely 14 months old, and she didn't have the words yet for what she was feeling, only the noise. Caleb went around to the back of the wagon and lifted her out of the quilted nest he'd made for her that morning from 2 blankets and his own coat. She grabbed his shirt with both fists and pressed her face against his chest, and the crying started to slow. He stood there in the middle of that dirt road, holding his daughter, looking at his broken wagon, and he did the arithmetic that had become the only math he ever did anymore. 1 horse, 1 broken wagon, 3 miles to Frost Creek, maybe more. $6.40 in his coat pocket. 2 children. No wife. No work. The wind picked up from the north, and it brought with it something that wasn't quite snow yet. More like the idea of snow, the cold edge of what was coming. Caleb had spent enough winters on the frontier to know that smell. Whatever was building up in those clouds wasn't more than a week away. Maybe less. "Is the wheel broken?" Wyatt had climbed down from the wagon without being told not to. He stood beside his father now, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking at the axle with an expression that was too old for his face. "Axle cracked." "Can you fix it?" Caleb looked at the split wood, the bent iron. "Not here." Wyatt nodded like this was information he was filing away. The boy had a way of absorbing bad news that made Caleb proud and uneasy in equal measure. A kid his age shouldn't be that practiced at it. "So we walk?" "We walk." He couldn't carry everything. He made that decision quickly, because there was no point drawing it out. He took the bedroll, the blanket chest, the small sack of food, 3 days of provisions if they were careful, less if they weren't, and the tin box he kept under the driver's seat. He left the rest. The extra tools, the broken rocking chair he'd been meaning to repair, the stack of old newspapers he'd been saving for insulation. Wyatt picked up the food sack without being asked. Caleb strapped Lila to his chest with the length of canvas he'd fashioned into a crude carrier months ago, and he shouldered the bedroll, and they started walking. The road to Frost Creek ran along the base of a long ridge, and the wind came funneling down from the pass above with nothing to slow it. Caleb kept his head down and counted his steps, and didn't let himself think about much. Thinking too far ahead had a way of making the distance feel worse than it was. You learn that out here. You learn to shrink your world down to the next 10 steps, then the next 10 after that. Wyatt walked without complaining. He stumbled once on a patch of ice and went down hard on one knee, and when Caleb started to reach for him, he was already back up, brushing the dirt off his pants with the kind of dignity that would have been almost funny in another situation. "I'm fine," the boy said. "I know you are." They walked. Frost Creek was smaller than Caleb had expected from the name. Most places named after something grand were trying to compensate for being ordinary, and this was no different. A main street of maybe 8 or 9 buildings, a water tower that needed painting, a livery at the far end, a general store with a porch that sagged on the left side. A few houses set back from the road, smoke coming from the chimneys. It was mid-afternoon by the time they came in off the ridge road, and there were enough people on the street to notice them. A man and 2 small children, no wagon, carrying their belongings on their backs. Caleb knew what they looked like. He'd been aware of it for a long time. He went to the general store first. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, with a mustache that did most of the work of expressing his opinions so his face didn't have to. He looked at Caleb, looked at Wyatt, looked at the baby strapped to Caleb's chest, and the mustache settled into something that wasn't quite a frown but wasn't far off. "Help you?" "Looking for work," Caleb said. "I'm a repairman. Barns, buildings, equipment. I'm good at finding what's wrong with a structure before it fails." He kept his voice even. He'd given this speech in 4 different towns in the last 3 weeks, and he'd learned to strip all the desperation out of it, because desperation made men nervous, and nervous men said no. "My wagon broke down outside of town. I've got 2 children who need a meal and a night out of the wind." The storekeeper's mustache moved. "Not hiring. I'm not asking to be hired. I'm asking if anyone in town needs repair work done. There's nothing in Frost Creek that needs fixing that the people of Frost Creek can't fix themselves." He said it with the particular pride of a man who believed strongly in things that weren't entirely true. Caleb looked at the porch visible through the window, the one sagging on the left side. He didn't say anything about it. "I appreciate your time." He tried 2 more places. Same story, more or less. A town this small had a way of deciding what it thought of you in the first 30 seconds, and Frost Creek had decided. He was standing on the street, trying to figure out his next move, when Wyatt tugged his sleeve. "That man's looking at us," the boy said quietly. Caleb turned. Across the street, leaning against the post outside the barber shop, was a broad-shouldered man in a good coat, the kind of coat that cost real money. He was maybe 50, with a square jaw, and the kind of stillness that comes from a man who's used to being the most important person in whatever room he's in. He was looking at Caleb with an expression that wasn't hostile exactly, more like appraisal. The man crossed the street, and Caleb noticed that the people on the street gave him a little room without even seeming to notice they were doing it. That told him something. "You just come in off the Ridge Road?" the man asked. "That's right." "Gideon Vale." He didn't offer his hand, just said the name like that was enough. Maybe in Frost Creek it was. "I own the Vale Ranch, 7 miles north, biggest operation in the valley." Caleb Rourke. Vale looked him over in that same unhurried way. "Where are you coming from?" "Most recently, Harlan Crossing. Before that, Cedar Post." "Harlan Crossing." Something shifted in Vale's expression. Not quite amusement. "They run you out, or you left on your own?" Caleb looked at the man steadily. "I left when there was no more work." "Uh-huh." Vale looked at Wyatt, then at Lila, still bundled against Caleb's chest. "You said you're a repairman. Barns, structures, equipment, water systems. I assess what's going to fail before it fails. A lot of men say that. A lot of men are wrong." Vale seemed to find that mildly interesting. Frost Creek doesn't have much use for outside opinions. These people have been doing things the same way for 20 years. "I've noticed," Caleb said. The corner of Vale's mouth moved slightly. It wasn't a smile. "There's one ranch in the valley that's been hemorrhaging help since August. Owner's a widow, Evelyn Hartwell. Husband died 2 winters back, and she's been running the place on half a crew ever since." He glanced toward the south end of town. "The Hartwell place is about 2 miles that way. She's stubborn as a fence post, and she's not going to welcome a stranger showing up at her door. But she's got a bunkhouse, and she might feed those children before she throws you out." He said it without warmth, as information, like he was reading from a ledger. Caleb couldn't quite tell if it was a kindness or something else. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb asked. Vale looked at him for a moment. "Because watching that ranch finally fall apart has gotten boring," he said. and then he turned and walked back across the street. Caleb stood there watching him go and filed that away. The Hartwell place came into view just as the light was starting to go thin and gray. 2 miles on foot with a baby and a 7-year-old felt longer than it was, and by the time they came up the track toward the ranch, Wyatt had stopped talking and was just walking, his breath coming out in small clouds that disappeared almost before they formed. Caleb saw the problems before he saw the house. That was just how his mind worked. It had always worked that way, even as a kid. He'd walk into a building and see the things that were wrong with it before he saw anything else. His wife Margaret used to say it made him a difficult man to go sightseeing with. The barn faced northwest. That was the first thing. In this part of the country, with the prevailing winds coming down from the north and hooking west along the ridge, that meant every major storm would hit the main door of the barn head on. Whoever had built it had either not known that or not cared. The hay storage was visible at the back of the property, a low structure, ground level, which meant moisture would be pulling up into the bottom layers all winter and the hay above it would be slowly going bad. The water trough near the corral was positioned in a narrow gap between 2 outbuildings where the cold would pool. First hard freeze, and that trough would be solid and useless. There were other things, smaller things, but those 3 alone were enough to tell him that the ranch was fighting the winter, rather than working with it. That was a fight nobody won. He was still cataloging when the front door of the house opened. Evelyn Hartwell was not what he'd expected, though he wouldn't have been able to say exactly what he had expected. She was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back without much ceremony, and the kind of posture that comes from doing physical work for years. Straight, not rigid, the posture of someone who knows how to carry weight. She had a shawl around her shoulders, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not warm. She had a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She wasn't pointing it at anyone. She didn't need to. "You're on private property," she said. Her voice was direct. Not aggressive, just not interested in wasting time. "My name is Caleb Rourke. I'm a repairman. A man in town, Gideon Vale, told me you might have work." Something crossed her face at Vale's name. Not quite irritation, something more complicated. "Gideon Vale sent you here. He mentioned your ranch. He didn't send me." She looked past him at Wyatt, standing slightly behind Caleb's right shoulder, and then at Lila. Lila had fallen asleep somehow during the last half-mile of walking, her head lolling against Caleb's chest with total trust in his ability to keep moving. "Those yours?" she asked. "Yes." "And your wife?" "Died 14 months ago." He said it the same way he said most hard things, plainly, without embroidery, because there was no version of the truth that was made easier by dressing it up. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard, rattling something loose on the side of the barn. She heard it. He saw her hear it, and he saw the small compression of her mouth that meant she'd heard it before and was tired of hearing it. "What do you want?" she asked. "Work, if you have it. I'm good at finding what's going to fail before it fails, and this ranch has things that are going to fail." He kept his voice level. "But tonight I want a warm place for my children. That's all I'm asking for tonight. And in exchange for that warm place, I'll tell you honestly what I see wrong with your operation. You can decide after that whether it's worth anything." She studied him. He didn't look away and didn't press. He'd learned that too, that pushing at the wrong moment was how you lost. You said your piece, and you let people take their time. "There are 5 ranch hands sleeping in the bunkhouse," she said finally. "I'll tell them to make room." She turned her eyes to Wyatt. "Boy, have you eaten today?" Wyatt glanced up at Caleb, then back at her. "Yes, ma'am. Some." "Some." She looked at Caleb again. "Bring them inside. I have leftover stew." She turned and went back through the door without waiting to see if he'd follow. The kitchen was warm and cluttered in the way that kitchens and working ranch houses always were. A pot on the stove, a row of boots by the door that was 1 pair too long for the hooks, a stack of papers on the corner of the table that had been there long enough to become part of the furniture. A lamp burned low over the table and threw light that was yellow and uneven. Evelyn ladled stew into bowls without asking how much they wanted. She set a bowl in front of Wyatt first, and the boy looked at it for a moment. That particular look he'd developed, the look of someone who was calculating whether this was real before he let himself want it. And then he picked up the spoon and started eating. Caleb sat across the table with Lila awake now, and squirming in his lap, interested in the lamp. He ate with one hand and kept the other on his daughter. A woman came through from the back of the house, older, maybe 60, with the kind of face that had made peace with whatever it had seen. Evelyn introduced her as Ruth, and didn't explain further, and Ruth sat down at the end of the table and watched Wyatt eat with an expression that was almost grandmotherly, if a grandmother had decided not to admit it. "Tell me what you think you saw," Evelyn said. She was standing at the counter, not sitting, her bowl in her hand. She ate like someone who was used to eating in the margins of doing other things. Caleb looked at her. "Your barn faces the wrong direction." She stopped. "The prevailing wind in this valley comes down off that ridge and hooks west. Every serious storm you get hits your main barn door head on. Your animals are working against the wind their entire winter just to stay warm, and every time you open that door during a storm, you're letting all the heat out." She said nothing. "Your hay storage is ground level. Whatever's on the bottom 2 feet is already compromised from moisture. You're losing 10, maybe 15% of your winter supply, and you probably won't know it until February when you're counting and coming up short." He watched her face. She was listening. "Your main water trough is positioned in a cold sink between the 2 outbuildings on the east side. First hard freeze, which in this valley is probably 3 weeks away at most. That trough is going to be solid ice by morning every night. Your hands are going to spend an hour every day breaking ice instead of doing useful work." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Wyatt's spoon against the bowl. Ruth was watching Caleb now, with an expression that had shifted from grandmotherly to something more like attention. "Anything else?" Evelyn said. "Yes," Caleb said, "but that's what I saw in the first 5 minutes." She set her bowl down on the counter. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding something, not about him exactly, but about the situation, about what the smart move was. He knew the look because he recognized what was behind it, the exhaustion of someone who'd been making every decision alone for long enough that even a simple one felt heavy. "Words are easy," she said. "Any man can walk up to a ranch and point at things." "That's true. What I need are results. I need things actually fixed, not just diagnosed." She crossed her arms. "I've had men work this ranch who could talk all day about what needed doing and never once pick up a tool." "I'm not much for talking," Caleb said, which was its own small irony given that he'd just done a considerable amount of it. "I just didn't want to start working on your property without telling you what I intended to do and why." "You're asking permission." "I'm telling you what I see and letting you decide. It's your ranch." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Wyatt, who had finished his stew and was sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him, looking at nothing in particular, doing that thing he did where he was very carefully not listening so that the adults would forget he was there. "How old is he?" she asked. 7. "And the baby?" 14 months. She nodded, just slightly. "You can use the bunkhouse tonight. There's a small separate room at the end for the baby. It was the foreman's room, before I lost my foreman." She said the last part without inflection, but something moved behind her eyes. "In the morning, you can show me what you think you want to do about the water trough. If it's reasonable, we'll talk about the rest." "That's fair," Caleb said. "Don't thank me yet." She picked up her bowl again. "If you're wrong about any of this, or if your fixes make things worse, you'll be back on that road by sundown tomorrow." "Understood." He meant it. He understood exactly. He'd been on that road before. The bunkhouse was warm enough, heated by a stove at one end that one of the ranch hands had kept going through the evening. There were 5 of them, all men, ranging from young to weathered. They received Caleb and his children with the particular wariness of men whose space was being shared without their consent, which was fair. The oldest of them, a compact man named Dell, who had a white scar along his chin, made room for Caleb's bedroll without being asked. He looked at Lila for a moment and then went back to his cards without saying anything. The youngest one, couldn't have been more than 19, crouched down to Wyatt's level. "What's your name?" "Wyatt." "You hungry? We got hardtack." Wyatt looked at the hardtack the young man was holding out. It was the kind of hardtack that looked like it could stop a bullet. "No, thank you," Wyatt said politely. "Good call," the young man said, grinning, and tossed it back on the table. Caleb got Lila settled in the foreman's room on a pile of blankets that the young man, Tom, apparently, produced from somewhere. The room was small and smelled like old cedar and someone else's boots, but it was dry and the wind wasn't getting in, and that was enough. He sat with his back against the wall while Lila fell asleep, and he let himself be still for the first time in 3 days. When you were moving, you couldn't afford to feel how tired you were, but the moment you stopped, it came down on you like a physical thing. He thought about Margaret. He did that less now than he had in the first months, which he supposed was progress, or maybe just the natural process of someone who'd been ground down enough that even grief had less purchase. She'd been smart and quick-tempered, and she'd laughed at things that weren't funny just to make Wyatt laugh. Lila had her ears. He thought about what he'd seen walking up to the ranch that afternoon, and his mind started moving through solutions the way it always did. Not deliberately, just the way water finds a route downhill. The water trough was the most urgent. He could reposition it to the south-facing wall of the main outbuilding within a day or two, maybe build a simple box cover to hold in heat. That alone would save the hands an hour of labor every freezing morning. The hay storage would take longer. He needed to inspect the current stock, see how much had already been compromised, build a raised platform that would bring air circulation underneath. The barn direction was the hardest problem. You couldn't turn a barn, but you could create a windbreak that redirected the flow before it hit the main door. He'd seen it done once, in a valley not unlike this one, a series of planted rows and low walls set at an angle 300 feet out, so the wind curved around them and lost its force before it reached the buildings. It sounded simple. It was not. He stayed awake longer than he intended, working through the problems in his mind. Lila breathed steadily in the dark beside him. Outside, the wind was picking up. He was up before dawn. It was a habit from the years before Margaret died, when the early mornings had been his. The only quiet hours in a life that was otherwise full of noise and need. He didn't know why he'd kept the habit after everything changed. Probably because some habits don't ask your permission, they just stay. He made coffee on the bunkhouse stove without waking anyone and stood at the window with the cup warming his hands, watching the light come up over the ridge. Dell came in from outside, stamping the cold off his boots. He saw Caleb and stopped. "Early riser," Dell said. "Usually." Dell poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. He had the quality of someone who didn't feel the need to fill silence. Caleb appreciated that. "How long has the trough been icing over?" Caleb asked. Dell looked at him. "Week and a half." "Every morning?" "Every morning below about 20 degrees, which is most mornings now. And nobody's moved it." Dell's expression stayed flat. "Mrs. Hartwell's husband put it where it is. Hasn't felt right to move it." Caleb nodded. He understood that. The dead leave geography behind, furniture in certain places, nails in certain walls. Moving it felt like erasing them. "It'll ice worse as winter comes on," Caleb said. "This valley's going to get cold that makes the last 3 weeks feel mild." Dell looked at him for a moment. "You know this valley?" "I know this type of valley. The way the ridge sits, the angle of the pass up there. Wind comes down from the north, hooks west, gets channeled. It's a trap." He looked out the window at the ridge line, still dark at its crest. Whoever picked this location for the ranch was looking at the water, probably. Creek runs year-round, that's good. But they didn't think about the wind. "Most people don't," Dell said, not admiringly, just as a fact. "Most people don't have to until they do." Dell drank his coffee. "Mrs. Hartwell told us you'd be looking at the trough this morning." "That's right." "And the rest of us?" "Business as usual. I'm not here to tell anyone how to do their job." He looked at Dell. "I'm here to fix the things that are going to kill this ranch before spring." Dell was quiet for a moment. Big words from a man who showed up with a broken wagon and no coat. Caleb looked down at himself. He was, in fact, wearing the same shirt he'd worn for 3 days, which was also the warmest thing he'd brought inside. "It's a fair point." Something in Dell's face shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but maybe the beginning of a consideration. "Tom's about your size. He's got a spare coat." "I'll pay for it when I can." "I'll tell him that." Dell set down his cup and went toward the back of the bunkhouse. "You're going to need it today. Temperature's dropping." Caleb looked north toward the ridge. He already knew. Evelyn was in the yard when he came out just after sunrise. She was looking at the trough, arms crossed, the way she had of standing that made her look like someone who'd decided in advance not to be impressed by whatever came next. He stopped beside her. They both looked at the trough. It had a skin of ice across the top that was maybe half an inch thick. "Tell me what you want to do with it," she said. He told her. South-facing wall of the main outbuilding, out of the shadow and the cold sink. A simple timber frame with a removable cover for the worst nights. If they got to it today, the hands would have flowing water tomorrow morning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The frame is going to use lumber I don't have to spare," she said. "The back of the smaller outbuilding on the east side has boards that are rotting from ground contact. They're not doing any good where they are. I can pull those and use them." She looked at him. "I noticed them when we came in yesterday," he said. "All right." She turned toward the main house. "I'll send Tom to help you." "I don't need help." "Tom's got nothing useful to do until the afternoon feed. Take the help." She paused without turning around. "And Mr. Rourke, breakfast in an hour. Ruth makes enough for whoever's in the kitchen." She went inside. Caleb stood in the cold yard looking at the frozen trough and felt something small and practical and necessary. The sense that the next few hours had a purpose, and after that the next few, and maybe that was enough to be getting on with. The wind came down off the ridge. The same wind that had been coming for weeks. The same wind that was going to keep coming harder and colder than anything Frost Creek had seen in a generation. He picked up his tools and went to work. The trough move took most of the morning. Tom turned out to be useful in the uncomplicated way that young men sometimes are. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He did what he was told, and when Caleb showed him something once, he generally didn't need to be shown again. They pulled the rotted boards from the east outbuilding first, and Caleb sorted through them the way you sort through anything that's been neglected, looking for what was still good underneath the damage, separating what could be saved from what was already gone. About half of them were usable. It was better than he'd expected. "These boards have been sitting like this for 2 winters at least," Tom said, tossing a badly rotted plank aside. "Nobody ever thought to pull them?" "People get used to things being the way they are," Caleb said. He was measuring a board against the span he needed, marking it with a piece of chalk. "After a while you stop seeing the problem. It just becomes part of the place." Tom considered this. That's kind of a sad way to think about it. It's just how it is. They moved the trough to the south wall of the main outbuilding by midday, working it across the frozen yard on 2 long poles because it was too heavy to carry flat. The horses watched them from the corral, with the blank, patient interest of animals who have decided that humans are mostly confusing but sometimes useful. Caleb built the timber frame in the afternoon. It was rough work, not pretty, but it was solid, and it would do the job. By the time the light started going, he had the removable cover fitted and the water flowing from the redirected feed line. Dell came over and looked at it without saying much. He put his hand on the frame, rocked it slightly, checked the joints. "It'll hold," he said, which from Dell seemed to be a significant endorsement. "Check it in the morning," Caleb said. "See how much ice you get." "I'll check it," Dell said, and went back to his work. Evelyn came out at dusk. She stood and looked at the new position of the trough, looked at the framing, looked at the cleared space where the trough had been for however many years. Her face didn't do much. He was beginning to understand that her face rarely did much, that she kept whatever she was thinking in some interior place and rationed out what she let show. "The boards from the east building," she said. "You sorted through them." "The usable ones went into the frame. The rest I stacked. They'll burn." "That's good." She was quiet for a moment. "That building's been needing attention for a while. I noticed some other issues with it. The south-facing wall has a gap where the siding's pulled away. Not big, but in a serious cold snap you'll get ice buildup inside the wall cavity. It'll split the boards from the inside out." She looked at him. "You noticed that this morning?" "I noticed things," he said, not defensively, just explaining. "How long to fix it?" "Half a day? Less if I have the right materials." She nodded, not committing to anything, just receiving the information. "There's food in the kitchen," she said, and turned and went back toward the house. The kitchen at Frost Creek had a rhythm to it that Caleb learned in those first days, the way you learn the habits of a household. You're living in the margins of. Ruth was almost always there before anyone else and still there after everyone had gone, moving around the stove and the work table with an efficiency that didn't look efficient because she never seemed to hurry. She made large quantities of simple food, and she had a way of setting a plate in front of someone that communicated clearly that she expected it to be eaten. Wyatt had attached himself to Ruth within about 24 hours of arriving, which surprised Caleb and apparently surprised Ruth too, though she didn't seem displeased about it. The boy had a need for a certain kind of steady female presence that Caleb understood but couldn't provide, and Ruth had apparently decided, without making any announcement about it, that she was going to fill that role whether or not anyone had asked her to. Caleb came in that evening to find Wyatt sitting at the end of the work table watching Ruth roll out biscuit dough, asking questions about the process with the focused interest he usually reserved for broken machinery. "Why do you fold it like that?" "Because if you just press it flat, the biscuits won't have layers." "What do the layers do?" "They make it taste better." Wyatt thought about this. "How?" Ruth looked at him. "You want to help or you want to keep asking questions?" A pause. "Both." "Pick one." "Help," Wyatt said, and climbed down from the stool and went to wash his hands without being told. Caleb watched this from the doorway and felt something complicated move through him. Gratitude, partly. A sharper thing underneath it that he didn't examine. He went to wash up at the basin, and when he came back, Evelyn was at the table, going through what looked like account books, the kind of thick, worn ledgers that accumulated years of numbers in cramped handwriting. She didn't look up when he sat down. He poured coffee and drank it and didn't bother her. After a few minutes, she said, without looking up, "The hay storage. You said the bottom layers are compromised." "I believe so. I'd need to get in there and look properly." "How much would you expect to have lost?" "Depends on how long the moisture's been getting in. If it's been 2 seasons, could be significant. If they put down a good ground cover before stacking, maybe less." She turned a page in the ledger. "My husband didn't put down ground cover. He didn't think it was necessary." Caleb said nothing to that. "He was a good man," she said, still not looking up. He did things the way his father had done them, and his father's way was 30 years out of date, and nobody had ever told him." She turned another page. "I knew some of it was wrong. I didn't know enough to know how to fix it." "Most people in that situation just keep going and hope," Caleb said. "I've been hoping for 2 winters." She looked up finally. Her eyes were direct and tired. "It's not a sustainable strategy." He almost smiled. "No, it isn't." She looked at him for a moment, studying him the way she did, that careful, measured look. "In the morning, I want you to go through the hay storage. Whatever you find, I want an honest accounting. Don't soften it." "I won't." "People soften bad news when they think you can't handle it," she said. "It's condescending, and it makes things worse." "I understand that." "Good." She went back to her ledger. "There are biscuits in about 20 minutes. The hay storage was worse than he'd told her it might be. Not catastrophically. The ranch wasn't going to starve its animals this winter on what he found, but worse than comfortable. The bottom 18 inches of every stack along the north wall had gone damp and gray, and when he pressed his hand into it, the material had that particular sour smell that meant it was already in the early stages of spoiling. In cold weather, it would slow, but it wouldn't stop. He spent 2 hours in there in the early morning, moving through the stacks methodically, pulling samples, estimating. When he came out, Evelyn was waiting by the door. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He gave her the numbers as honestly as he could estimate them. Roughly 18 to 20% of the total winter hay supply already compromised, and that number would continue to grow unless they got the good stock up off the ground. They needed to pull the bad material out and burn it before it contaminated the layers above. She stood and listened with her arms at her sides, not crossed. He noticed she crossed her arms when she was being defensive and dropped them when she was just taking in information. "If I lose 20% of the hay going into the worst part of winter," she said, "you'll be short. Probably not disastrously short if we get the rest up off the ground now and stop the spread. But you'll need to be careful with rationing from January on." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking past him at the storage building. My husband built that structure 3 years before he died. He was proud of it. Caleb waited. He'd be furious if he knew it was killing the hay. She said it without sentiment, almost wry. He was a man who hated being wrong. Most men are. She looked at him. You're not. He considered the question honestly. I hate it too. I just learned early that being wrong and not admitting it is worse than just being wrong. She seemed to turn this over. How do you build the platform for raising the stock? He explained it. A simple raised frame, enough airflow underneath to break the moisture cycle. She asked practical questions, good ones, the kind that came from someone who understood the physical requirements of what she was running. He answered them straight, and she nodded at the answers or asked follow-up questions, and by the time they were done, she had a clear picture of what needed doing. I'll have Dell and Tom help you, she said. Get started today if you can. I can. She turned to go and then stopped. Mr. Rourke, what you told me last night about the East Outbuilding wall. I can get to that after the hay platform is done. How many things do you see that need fixing? He looked at her carefully, trying to gauge what she was asking, whether she wanted the full list or the most urgent one. On this ranch? On this ranch. He thought about it honestly. 14. Maybe 15, depending on some things I haven't been able to look at yet. She was quiet for a moment. 14. In descending order of urgency. The hay and the windbreak are the top two. After that, the windbreak, she said. That's the big thing you mentioned before. It's the biggest thing. The barn facing northwest. You can't turn the barn, but you can build a system that changes how the wind hits it. A series of brakes set at an angle out from the property, designed to slow the wind and redirect it before it reaches the buildings. How long does something like that take? Done right? 3 weeks of solid work, maybe 4. She looked north toward the ridge, the same direction Caleb had been looking at since he arrived. And we have maybe 3 weeks before the real cold comes. 2.5, he said. Maybe less. She looked back at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw something shift in her face that wasn't just evaluation, something that acknowledged the difficulty of the math without flinching at it. Then we'd better not waste mornings standing around talking about it. No, he said. We'd better not. Gideon Vale came to the ranch on the 4th day. Caleb was up on the hay storage roof, checking the line of the rafters for the platform supports he was planning, when he heard the horse come into the yard. He didn't come down immediately. The check mattered, and he wanted to finish it. But he watched from above as Vale dismounted and handed his reins to Tom and walked toward the main house with that same unhurried authority he'd displayed on the street in town. Evelyn came out before Vale reached the porch. She met him in the yard, which Caleb had already noticed was how she preferred to conduct business she was uncertain about. On her own ground, in the open, where she could see everything. He couldn't hear what they said, but he could read the shape of the conversation from 30 feet up on a rooftop. Vale's expansive, inclusive gestures, Evelyn's stillness, the moment Vale looked around the yard and saw the new trough position, and his gestures paused just slightly. Then Vale looked up and saw Caleb on the roof. They looked at each other for a moment across the yard. Vale's face did something complicated. Then he looked back at Evelyn, and the conversation continued. Dell came up beside the hay storage below and called up, "You coming down?" "In a few minutes." "Vale wants to look around." "That's not my decision." Dell was quiet for a moment. "He owns the banknote on this ranch," he said, not lowly, just informatively. "Half of it, anyway. Has since about a year after Mr. Hartwell died." Caleb looked down at him. Dell shrugged. "Thought you should know the geography." Caleb came down off the roof and crossed the yard as Vale was completing his circuit, Evelyn walking alongside him with her hands in her coat pockets. Vale stopped when Caleb approached, and there was a beat where the three of them stood in something that wasn't quite a triangle, but felt like one. "Rourke," Vale said, "you've been busy." "Some." Vale looked at the trough, the frame around it, the new position against the south wall. Troughs moved. It was icing over every night. It iced over every winter for 15 years in that spot. "I know," Caleb said. "That's why I moved it." Vale's eyes were steady and cool. He wasn't hostile. He was something more measured than hostile, the particular manner of a man who didn't need to be hostile because he had other kinds of power and knew it. What else are you planning to change around here? Caleb looked at Evelyn. She gave him nothing. No direction, just watching. I'm going to raise the hay storage platform, repair the east outbuilding wall, and build a windbreak system on the north and northwest sides of the property, Caleb said. The windbreak is the most critical. The storm system that hits this valley in deep winter is going to be worse than usual this year. Vale looked at him with what might have been amusement. And you know this how? The snowpack on that ridge is already above what it should be for this point in the season. The soil freeze started 2 weeks early. The animals are putting on their coats early. The deer in the timber north of here, the cattle. He paused. I've seen this pattern before. I was in Halloran Valley in '84 when the Black Creek blizzard came through. The signs were the same. Halloran Valley, Vale said. That was a bad one. Yes, it was. Vale looked at him for a moment, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not respect, but a recalibration, like a man adjusting numbers in his head. A windbreak system that actually works takes time to establish, which is why I'm starting immediately. You can't plant windbreak trees in November. I'm not talking about trees, I'm talking about a constructed system, earthwork berms, timber frames, positioned to redirect the airflow before it hits the buildings. You can build it in weeks. It won't last forever, but it'll last the winter. Vale looked at Evelyn. You're letting him do this? Evelyn looked back at him with an expression that was perfectly polite and told him absolutely nothing. I'm letting him try, she said. The alternative is doing nothing, which hasn't been working. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb again. You're a repairman from somewhere south of here, with a broken wagon and 2 small children and no references that anyone in this valley can check. And you're telling me you're going to build something in 2 weeks that will protect this ranch from a blizzard you're predicting based on deer hair. Essentially, Caleb said. Vale looked at him. Caleb looked back. The wind moved across the yard and rattled the thing on the barn wall that always rattled. Vale made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. All right, he said, to Evelyn, not to Caleb. It's your property, your decisions. He moved toward his horse, then stopped and looked back. When the storm comes and his windbreak fails, I want first option on the cattle. Evelyn said nothing. Vale mounted and rode out. What happened after Vale left was not a conversation that Caleb and Evelyn had out loud. It was more like a shared acknowledgement. They were both aware of what had been said, what it meant, and neither of them felt the need to discuss it in detail. She went back to the house. He went back to his work. But something had settled between them, the way things settle when 2 people have stood in the same wind and neither one has moved. He started the windbreak planning that afternoon, working it out on paper in the evenings after supper. Not in his bunkhouse room, but at the kitchen table because the light was better and Ruth kept coffee going until late. He drew rough diagrams and calculations, tested angles, crossed things out, and started over. On the second evening, Evelyn sat across from him and looked at the diagrams. She didn't ask permission to look. She just sat down and started reading. These outer berms, she said after a while, pointing to the furthest element of the design. You want them how high? About 4 feet. They're not the main barrier. They're just the first disruption. The wind hits them and loses maybe 20% of its force, and then it has to rise over them, and by the time it's dropped back down, it's already past the outer frame. She studied the diagram. Her finger moved along the lines. And these 2 angled frames here, those are the main deflectors. If I can get the angle right, about 30 degrees off the wind's natural path, it'll push the flow around the barn rather than into it. How do you know the wind's natural path? He had thought about how to explain this. You watch it, he said. You watch what it does to the snow on the ground, to the grass, to the things it moves and the things it doesn't. You watch it for a few days and you start to see the shape of it. She looked at him. You've been watching it since you arrived. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. My husband used to say that a man who spends all his time studying a problem is just afraid to start solving it. Some problems will kill you if you start solving them before you understand them. She considered that. And you understand this one? He looked at the diagram. There were things he was still uncertain about. The exact sighting of the second deflector frame, the height of the outer berm in relation to the barn's roofline. He could get those wrong. He probably would get at least one of them at least partly wrong, and he'd have to tear it apart and fix it. I understand it well enough to start, he said. I'll understand the rest by doing it. She nodded. She stood up and then paused. Mr. Rourke? Caleb, he said. It came out more directly than he'd intended. She looked at him for a moment. Caleb, what you said to Vale today about the storm, I believe it. I know you do. I'm not questioning that. She folded her hands. If you're right, and the storm is as bad as you think, and the windbreak isn't finished, I'll finish it. You said 2 to 3 weeks. I'll finish it, he said again. Not boasting, just saying it the way he said hard things, without embroidery. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, Good night, and went toward the back of the house. He started on the windbreak the following morning, and what happened over the next 10 days was the kind of work that doesn't look dramatic from outside, but costs everything from inside. The sustained, grinding, relentless labor of building something big in deteriorating weather with not enough hands and not enough time. Dell helped when he could. Tom helped when he was assigned to. The other 3 hands, a pair of brothers named Marcus and Pete, and a quiet older man called Sutter who mostly kept to himself, cycled through as their other duties allowed. Nobody was working only on the windbreak. Everyone was also doing the regular work of a cattle ranch in early winter, feeding, maintenance, keeping the animals healthy. Caleb worked longer hours than anyone else. He was up before the others and still outside when they came in for the evening meal. He didn't make a point of it. He just did it, because the calendar was what it was, and the work was what it was, and the math between those 2 things required it. On the 3rd day of the windbreak construction, the first berm frame failed. He'd cited it based on his observation of the wind patterns over the first few days, but a shift in the ridgeline flow he hadn't fully accounted for was putting the load at an angle the frame wasn't built for. He noticed it in the morning when he found the posts had shifted 4 inches overnight, not catastrophically, but enough. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Tom came over. That's not going to hold, Tom said. No. Do we shore it up? Caleb shook his head. If I shore it up in the wrong place, I'm just delaying the failure. He walked the length of the berm, pressing his boot against the base of each post, watching how the soil responded. It needs to come down and go back up with a different footing angle. That's 2 days of work? 1.5 if we start now. Tom looked at him. That's going to put us behind. I know. Caleb looked at the failed frame, feeling the thing he always felt when a plan broke against reality. The urge to defend it, to look for reasons it wasn't his fault, followed quickly by the recognition that those reasons didn't matter and the frame still had to come down. He pulled the first post and started the work. Word got around the ranch, the way word does. By evening, Dell had heard about it, and then Evelyn had, and Caleb expected questions or commentary, but what he got instead was that she came out the next morning and started helping dig the new footings without saying anything about the previous ones. He almost said something about it. He decided not to. They worked for 2 hours in the cold, the ground grudging and half frozen, and she dug with the same quality that she did most physical work. Not fast, but consistent, not stopping to rest more than she needed to. Her breath came out in steady clouds. Your husband didn't build the windbreak that was needed, Caleb said, not accusatorially, just stating a thing. My husband didn't think it was needed, she said. He thought the ridge protected the valley enough. The ridge creates a funnel on the northwest side. It makes it worse. I know that now. She drove the digger into the frozen ground again. He wasn't a stupid man, Caleb. He just didn't... He trusted what he'd been told. His father's ranch was on flat ground, no ridge, no funnel. He applied what he knew to a situation where it didn't apply. Caleb thought about that. And nobody told him it was wrong. I hinted at it once. He didn't appreciate the hint. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact, one of the accumulated facts of a life spent with someone. I didn't press it. That's on me, too. They dug in silence for a while. The new footing angle is correct, Caleb said. I checked it 3 times this morning. I believe you, she said, which was the kind of thing that was more meaningful for coming from her than it would have been from someone who gave it more easily. Wyatt came to find him on the 9th day. Caleb was working alone in the late afternoon, fitting the second major deflector frame, when he heard footsteps in the frozen grass and looked back to see his son picking his way across the torn-up ground north of the barn. Wyatt had a piece of bread in one hand and his coat was buttoned crooked, the way it always was because he always buttoned it too fast. "Ruth said to bring you this," Wyatt said, holding up the bread. "Tell Ruth thank you." Wyatt stayed. He looked at the frame going up. The posts angled at their deliberate offset, the crossbeams not yet in place. "Is it going to work?" Caleb looked at his son. "I think so." "You said you weren't sure earlier." "I'm more sure now than I was." Wyatt looked at the frame for a while longer. "That man in town looked at us like we were trouble," he said, out of nowhere. "Which man?" "The one with the good coat." Caleb kept working, fitting a crossbeam to the top of the nearest post. People look at people they don't know and make up their minds fast. It's not personal. It feels personal. I know it does. He tested the fit of the beam. But what he thinks of us isn't what matters. What matters is what we do. Wyatt was quiet for a bit. Then, in that careful, flat voice of his, "Are we going to stay here?" Caleb stopped what he was doing. He looked at his son, the boy's straight-ahead gaze, the bread still in his hand getting cold, the coat buttoned wrong. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's not decided." "Do you want to?" He thought about the answer honestly, the way he'd taught himself to think about things. He thought about the kitchen table at night and the diagrams and Evelyn's finger tracing the angles of the windbreak. He thought about Dell's wordless competence in Ruth's kitchen and the ridge north of the property that was both the problem and the reason the land was worth fighting for. "I want to finish what I started," he said finally. "That's what I know right now." Wyatt nodded, accepting this. He handed his father the bread and started picking his way back toward the house across the frozen ground. Caleb watched him go. Then he turned back to the frame and kept working, his breath coming out white in the cold air, the ridge sitting heavy above him against a sky that was the wrong color for this time of afternoon. Too flat, too pale, the particular bleached-out gray that he had last seen in Halloran Valley in the winter of 1884, 4 days before everything went wrong. He worked faster. The sky that had been the wrong color for 3 days finally made good on its promise. It started as snow. Ordinary enough, the kind that came every winter in this valley, fat flakes drifting down in the windless early morning hours while the ranch was still quiet. Caleb woke at 4 and looked out the small window of the foreman's room and watched it fall and felt something in his chest tighten that wasn't quite fear but was related to it. Lila was asleep behind him, her breathing slow and even. He dressed without lighting the lamp and went outside. The windbreak was done. Mostly. The outer berms were finished, all 3 of them, and the 2 main deflector frames were up and braced. The third deflector, the smaller angled piece on the far northwest corner that would close the gap between the second frame and the natural slope of the ground, was still missing its upper crossbeams. He'd run short of usable timber 2 days ago and had sent Tom to Frost Creek for more, and Tom had come back with what the general store had, which was not quite enough. He'd been trying to make it work with what he had. He stood in the falling snow and looked at the incomplete northwest corner and did the arithmetic again. In light snow, normal snow, it didn't matter much. The main deflectors would do 80% of the work. But if the storm that was coming was what he believed it was, that open corner was a gap in the line. Dell came out of the bunkhouse behind him, pulling his coat on. "It started," Dell said. "An hour ago, maybe more." Dell looked north. The ridge was gone. Swallowed in gray, the tree line at its base barely visible. "How bad?" "Bad," Caleb said. "The ridge is already socked in. That means the storm's sitting on top of it, not passing over. It'll be here by afternoon." Dell was quiet for a moment, looking at the incomplete corner of the windbreak. He'd been out there enough days to know what was done and what wasn't. "You need that last section." "I need timber I don't have." "The old equipment shed on the back of the property," Dell said. "Northeast corner, past the second pasture. It's been empty 3 years. The roof's half gone already." Caleb looked at him. "It's Evelyn's call," Dell said. But it's standing timber that isn't doing anything. Caleb went to the house. It was barely 5 in the morning, and he knocked anyway, because there wasn't time not to. Evelyn answered the door faster than he expected, which meant she'd already been awake, which meant she'd also seen the sky. She was still pulling a shawl around her shoulders. She looked past him at the falling snow, at the ridge that wasn't there anymore, and her face did the thing it did when she was calculating. "The equipment shed," Caleb said. "The one past the second pasture." "I know which one." "Dell says the roof's already gone. I need the wall framing, the uprights, and the horizontal members. It's enough to finish the northwest corner." She looked at him. "You tear down that shed, it's gone. I can't put it back." "I know." She was quiet for a long moment. The snow fell between them, soft and deliberate, the way snow falls when it has all the time in the world. "Take what you need," she said. He had Dell and Tom and Marcus at the equipment shed by 5:30, working in the snow with lanterns because the sky wasn't giving enough light yet. The shed came apart faster than he expected. 3 years of weather had done most of the work already, and the wall framing pulled free with less argument than sound timber would have put up. They loaded it on the flatbed and got back to the windbreak site as the light was beginning to come up gray and diffuse behind the cloud cover. Caleb worked the northwest corner himself, fitting the uprights into the prepared holes, driving the braces at their angles. His hands were cold inside the gloves, Tom's coat, Tom's gloves, both a little too large, and the falling snow was starting to have some weight to it now, some intention. The flakes were smaller than they'd been an hour ago. That was a sign. Small flakes meant the temperature was dropping. Marcus held the first crossbeam while Caleb drove the fasteners. The beam kept wanting to shift. The frozen ground beneath the post base is not quite as solid as he'd have liked. "Hold it steady," Caleb said. "I am holding it steady." "Hold it steadier." Marcus said something under his breath that Caleb chose not to hear and held the beam steadier. By 9 in the morning, the northwest corner was up. Caleb walked the full length of the windbreak, all 3 berms, both main deflectors, the smaller angled closer, pressing his hand to each post, testing each joint. Some of it was rougher than he'd have liked. The second berm had a section of the facing that he'd had to improvise with split rounds instead of flat planking, and it bothered him. But it would deflect. That was the thing that mattered. Not whether it looked right, but whether it would do the work. He came back to the barn end and stood there and looked at the whole system, trying to see it the way the wind would see it, the way air moving at force would encounter those surfaces and be redirected, slowed, divided. He'd been right about the angle. He was fairly sure he'd been right about the angle. But there were things you couldn't know until the storm arrived and showed you. Evelyn was standing at the barn door watching him. "It's done," he said. "How sure are you?" He considered giving her a number. He decided against it. "Sure enough," he said. The northwest corner was the last risk. "It's up now." She nodded. She looked at the sky, and he saw her do the same calculation he'd been doing all morning. The ridge gone, the clouds flat and low and moving with that particular urgency, the snow picking up. "I want everyone inside the main buildings by noon," she said. "Feed done, animals secured, everyone in." "That's a good call." She looked at him. "The cattle in the far north pasture need to be brought in this morning. All of them. I'd normally send 3 men, but—" "Send all of them," Caleb said. "I'll stay and secure what needs securing here." She hesitated. He saw it. "The windbreak won't fail because I'm not standing next to it," he said. Something moved across her face. Not amusement, but close to the neighborhood of it. "All right." She turned to go. "Ruth's making a hot meal at 10. Don't be out here instead of eating it." "I'll be there," he said. He wasn't there. He was still working at 10:15, adding a secondary brace to the base of the second deflector frame where the ground was softer than he trusted. And by the time he got to the kitchen, Ruth had put a plate aside for him without comment, and the rest of the table was already clearing. He ate standing at the counter, which Ruth tolerated with visible disapproval. Wyatt was at the table with Lila on his lap, feeding her pieces of biscuit with the careful concentration of someone performing a task that had been officially delegated to him. Lila had food on her face and was entirely pleased with herself. She reached up and grabbed Wyatt's ear with one small fist, and he made a face but didn't pull away. Caleb watched them for a moment over his coffee. He felt the tightness in his chest again, that not quite fear. He looked at the window. The snow was heavier now, the yard visible, but the far outbuildings starting to blur. "Caleb," Evelyn's voice from the doorway. He turned. She was looking at the window too. "The hands are back with the cattle. Everyone's in." "Good. I want you and your children in the main house tonight, not the bunkhouse." He started to say that wasn't necessary. "The bunkhouse stove is adequate for 5 adult men," she said. "It's not adequate for a 14-month-old in a serious blizzard. Don't argue with me about this." He looked at her. She looked back, steady and direct, waiting to see if he was going to be foolish about it. "All right," he said. "M'shay." The storm arrived like something that had been building its whole life for this moment. It didn't announce itself with a gust or a howl. What happened instead was that the snow went from heavy to white, just suddenly, completely, impenetrably white in every direction. And the wind that came with it wasn't loud at first so much as it was absolute, a solid presence that pressed against every surface of every building at once. The temperature had been dropping all morning, and by mid-afternoon it dropped off a cliff, the kind of cold that gets inside your clothes and your skin and your sense of how the world works. Caleb stood at the main house window and watched the windbreak disappear into the white. He couldn't see it. That was the thing. He'd spent 2.5 weeks building it, and now he couldn't see it from 50 yards away. He could only know it was there and trust what he'd put into it, which was not a comfortable feeling for a man who worked in the physical and the measurable. Dell came in from the bunkhouse through the connecting passage they'd rigged that morning, a rope line strung between the two buildings so nobody would get lost in the yard if they had to go between them. He was covered in snow from a 20-foot transit. "Wind's coming from the northwest," Dell said, stamping his boots. "Hard." "I know." "Barn's holding. I could hear it from the bunkhouse." That meant the barn walls were taking less force than they would have without the deflectors. Or it meant the storm wasn't yet at its worst. Caleb didn't know which. Ruth moved through the house with the particular focused calm of a woman who had survived enough difficult things to know that panic was inefficient. She added wood to the stove at regular intervals. She made soup that nobody asked for and set it on the back burner where it would stay hot. She found extra blankets from somewhere in the back of the house and distributed them without ceremony. Wyatt had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was scared. Not visibly scared, not crying, just the particular stillness of a child who was holding very carefully still inside himself. He sat near the stove with light up out there in the white. Caleb had given up trying to see the windbreak from the window. He'd walked the rope line to the barn twice, checking the animals, and both times coming back had been an experience in controlled disorientation. The rope was the only reality, the only line between him and becoming genuinely lost in 20 feet of open yard. He was at the barn the second time, doing his check of the cattle, counting heads, checking water, making sure the hay he'd put down that morning was holding, when he heard the sound above him. He stopped, listened. The roof of the barn was doing something it shouldn't. There was a rhythmic impact above the main door, the kind of sound a piece of roofing makes when it's come partially loose and the wind is working at it. Not a catastrophic failure, not yet, but the wind was systematic and patient, and it would get there. He went back out into the white and around the side of the barn and found what he'd feared. A section of the roof sheeting on the windward side had pulled at one corner. Not large, a 2-foot gap, maybe 3. But the wind was finding that gap and using it, each gust working the sheeting a little further loose. He went back inside and found Dell at the rope line end. "Roof section loose on the windward side," Caleb said. Dell's face didn't change much. "How bad?" "Not catastrophic, yet. But if the wind keeps working it, it'll keep working it. I need to get up there and nail it back down." Dell looked at him. "In this. If it goes, we lose the roof section. We lose heat. We could lose animals." Dell looked at the white beyond the door. The wind was running at something Caleb couldn't put a number to. It didn't matter what the number was. It was enough to make standing upright a negotiation. "I'll hold the rope," Dell said. Evelyn appeared from somewhere behind Dell. Caleb didn't know how long she'd been there. Her face was doing the calculation thing. "No," she said. Both men looked at her. "I'll hold the rope," she said. "Dell, I need you inside with the cattle in case something else happens. 2 people can't both be on the outside of the barn at the same time." Dell opened his mouth. "Dell," she said, without raising her voice, and he closed it. Caleb looked at her. It could be a two-handed job when I get up there. Then I'll come up. Caleb. She said his name the way she said most things, directly, without room for argument. I've been on that roof in better weather than this. I know where the bracing is. Stop wasting time. They went out together. He'd spent enough time in bad weather to know that you didn't fight it. You moved through it. You worked with it. You found the moments when the gusts paused and you used them. The wind out there was running in a pattern, not random. Sustained pressure, hard gust, brief, almost pause, sustained pressure again. He counted the rhythm on the way to the barn wall, and by the time he got there, he had the tempo of it. He went up the side ladder with the repair nails in his coat pocket and the hammer in his right hand, and she came up behind him, and the roof was a different world up there. The wind had nothing to slow it, nothing to redirect it, and it hit with a force that was physical and personal, the kind of weather that feels like it's making a point. The loose section was exactly where he'd identified it. He found it in the white by putting his hands on the roof surface and feeling for the movement, the vibration of a piece that wasn't secured. He got his knee on it to hold it flat, felt Evelyn's weight settling beside him, and started driving nails in the pause between gusts. The first gust before he'd finished the first nail pulled the sheeting hard enough that he lost the nail and had to find another. He didn't say anything. He found another nail and waited for the pause. The second nail went in clean, the third. She had her hands on the sheeting, too, flat-palmed, putting her weight on the section next to the gap, and she held it steady without being asked while he worked. They couldn't talk over the wind. They didn't need to. There was a shorthand to working alongside someone in difficult conditions, when the wind's too loud for words, and the only language is what your hands are doing. And they had developed something like that language in the past weeks, without either of them acknowledging it. He drove 8 nails. On the 7th, his hammer slipped in the gust and hit his left hand instead of the nail head, and the pain was sharp and immediate, and he held it for a moment, breathing through his teeth, and then drove the 8th nail. "Done," he said, into the wind, knowing she couldn't hear him, but saying it anyway. They came down off the roof. He didn't look at his left hand until they were back inside the barn. When he did, in the lamplight, it was bleeding from a cut across the 2 middle knuckles. Not serious, not deep, but his hand was already stiffening from the cold and the impact both. Evelyn saw it. She didn't say anything until they were back inside the house, rope-line transit, white blur, door shut, heat. Then she said, "Sit down," and went to get the medical kit. He sat. Ruth appeared briefly, assessed the situation with the efficiency she applied to everything, and disappeared again. "It's not bad," he said when Evelyn came back. "I know it's not bad. Sit still." She opened the kit on the table in front of him. Her hands were competent and not gentle and not rough. Practical, the way she was practical about everything. "I should check the windbreak," he said. "You cannot see the windbreak. You cannot see anything. You are going to sit here while I bandage your hand, and then you're going to do whatever useful thing can be done from inside this building." He sat still. Wyatt was watching from across the room, the way he watched things. Cataloging. Lila was asleep somehow, which was both a relief and a small miracle, given the sound of the storm. "It hurts," Wyatt said, not asking, just observing. "Some," Caleb said. "You didn't make a sound." "I made a sound. You were across the room." Wyatt appeared to accept this. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. Evelyn tied off the bandaging and sat back. She looked at his hand, then up at him, and there was something in her face that she let show for a moment. The particular expression of someone who had been keeping careful track of what was happening and had just seen something that shifted the count. He wasn't entirely sure what it was. He didn't look away from it. Then she looked at the window, at the white nothing beyond the glass. "The barn roof is holding now," she said. "Yes." "The windbreak?" "I don't know yet. I won't know until it's over and we can see it." She nodded. She folded her hands on the table. It was past midnight when the section of the windbreak failed. Caleb heard it, or thought he heard it, through the wall of the storm, a different quality of sound from the sustained pressure, something structural giving way. He was awake because he hadn't been able to sleep, stretched out on the floor near the stove with his coat over him. his bandaged left hand aching in that dull, specific way that injuries ache in the cold. He was up and at the window before the sound had finished registering. He couldn't see anything, but he knew. He knew the way he'd known the storm was coming. Not certainty, but the weight of accumulated information pressing toward a conclusion. He went to the rope line. Dell was awake in the bunkhouse, which surprised him. The man was sitting on the edge of his bunk in the lamplight, boots already on. "You heard it," Dell said. "I heard something. Second main deflector. I heard it go about 20 minutes ago. I was waiting to see if you'd come." 20 minutes. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wasn't going out there alone and I didn't have a good reason to wake everyone up based on a sound I heard through 2 walls in a blizzard," Dell said flatly. "Now you're here, and we have too." Caleb looked at him. "I need rope. Long rope." "I've got it." They tied off to the main house anchor point, a heavy iron ring sunk into the exterior wall that Caleb had put there himself 10 days ago for exactly this reason. He hadn't told anyone what it was for. He just put it there. Dell had watched him do it without asking questions, which Caleb had appreciated. The yard was a different world than the barn roof had been. Out here there was nothing. No surface, no up or down that your body could verify. Just the wind and the white and the rope in his hand. He moved by feel, counting his steps, the rope feeding out behind him. He found the second deflector frame by walking into it. It had failed at the base. One of the main posts had pulled from its footing, which had happened because the footing on that side was in the softer ground he'd been worried about, the ground that hadn't been quite frozen enough when he'd set the post. He'd added a secondary brace to compensate. The brace hadn't been enough. The frame was leaning at an angle, maybe 30 degrees off vertical. Not down, not gone. Leaning. He stood in the white and the wind and looked at it. The frame he'd built. Leaning in the storm it was supposed to resist. He felt something that he was honest enough to call what it was. He felt like he'd failed. Not in some abstract way, but specifically and mechanically, because he hadn't driven those footings deep enough on the soft side, and he'd known it was the weak point, and he'd convinced himself the brace was sufficient. He put his hands on the frame and pushed against the lean. It moved back, reluctantly, against the wind's pressure. But it moved. The post wasn't broken, just pulled. If he could reseat it and add a real brace, something better than what he'd used. Dell was beside him. Caleb hadn't heard him come. He pointed at the leaning post. He mimed what he needed. Hold the frame while he reseated the base. Dell nodded and put his weight against the frame. The wind pushed back. Dell was a compact man, but he was strong and he planted his boots and he held. And Caleb went down on his knees in the snow and dug with his good hand at the base of the post, feeling for the footing, the frozen ground so cold against his palm that it stopped being cold and became something else. He got the post base reseated. He drove the temporary spike he'd brought in his pocket, small, inadequate, but enough to hold until he could do it properly. He needed to brace it. He needed something to brace it against. He looked around him in the white and saw nothing he could use. He hadn't brought anything to brace it with. He'd come out with a spike and a hammer and good intentions, and that was not enough. He was still thinking about this when Dell grabbed his shoulder and pointed. There was a shape in the white. A man coming toward them from the wrong direction, from the north, from outside the ranch boundaries, staggering, moving the way people move when they're past cold and into something worse. He was following the windbreak line, had apparently found the outer berm in the storm and followed it south, looking for something solid to navigate by. Caleb and Dell reached him at the same moment. He went down as they got to him. His legs just stopped working, the way legs stop working when the body has been spending its heat on something other than muscle. Caleb got under his right arm and Dell took the left, and they moved him, the rope line their only guide back through the white. Getting him through the main house door was not graceful. The storm pushed against them the whole way, and the man was mostly dead weight by the time they made it to the porch. And there was a bad moment when Caleb's boots went out from under him on the ice-slicked step, and he went down on one knee and felt his bandaged hand hit the door frame, and the pain came up hard and red, and he said something that wasn't a word exactly. Then Dell had the door open, and they were in. Ruth appeared immediately, which was either extremely good timing or she hadn't slept at all. She looked at the man they were holding between them, ice on his face, His coat inadequate for what he'd been through, his hands the gray-white color that meant real danger, and she moved without hesitation, directing them to the main room, pulling blankets. Evelyn was there a moment later. She looked at the man. A long beat. "That's Hale Morrison," she said. "He works for Gideon Vale." Caleb looked at her. "He's one of Vale's hands," she said. "What's he doing out here?" Nobody had an answer for that. The man, Morrison, was not in any condition to provide one. He was breathing, which was the primary thing, his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. Ruth had his coat off and was working on getting him warm the right way, the slow, controlled way, because warming someone too fast after serious cold does its own damage. Evelyn looked at Caleb. "You went out there." The second deflector was leaning. "You went out there in this." If the deflector went down, the barn door would have been fully exposed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at his hand, at the way he was holding it, slightly away from his body. The bandage darkened. "You opened it again. It'll close." She pressed her lips together in that way she had when she was deciding whether to argue with something. She decided not to. "Is the deflector holding?" "I reseated the post. It's temporary. I need to brace it properly when there's light and the wind drops." "Will it hold until then?" He thought about the spike he'd driven, the reseated post, the angle of the lean against the wind's direction. "I think so," he said. "I don't know." She nodded. She looked at Morrison, Ruth's hands moving over him with practiced efficiency. "He needs to warm up slowly," Caleb said. "Not too fast." "Ruth knows that," Evelyn said. He sat down on the bench by the door. He was more tired than he'd been aware of, the kind of tired that only arrives when you stop moving. His left hand was reporting steadily to him about its condition. He listened to the storm working against the walls of the house, the sustained pressure, the hard gust, the brief almost pause, and tried to read in that pattern how the windbreak was doing. Wyatt appeared from the back room, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Morrison on the floor, at Ruth, at Dell still dripping snow by the door, at Caleb on the bench. "Is he dead?" Wyatt asked. "No," Caleb said. Wyatt looked at his father's hand. "You're bleeding again." "Some. Through the bandage." "I know, it's not serious." Wyatt stood there for a moment, processing the room, the way he processed things, systematically, filing. Then he went to where Caleb was sitting and sat down beside him on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and didn't say anything else. Caleb didn't say anything either. Outside, the Black Hollow blizzard was still working. It would work through the rest of the night and into the next day, patient and absolute, spending itself against the land with the indifference of a thing that doesn't know what indifference is. And inside the walls that were still standing, people waited. Morrison's color came back by morning, not all at once. It was gradual, the way color returns to something that's been drained, first in the center of his face, and then working outward toward the ears and the jaw. Ruth had kept at it through the night with the patient persistence she applied to everything. And by the time the storm was still howling outside and the lamps had burned through their first fill and needed tending, Morrison was breathing right, and his hands had gone from gray-white back to something closer to living. He woke up confused, which was expected, and then frightened, which was also expected. And then when Ruth told him where he was and what had happened, he went quiet for a long time and looked at the ceiling. Caleb was at the table with coffee when Morrison finally sat up on his own. The man was maybe 40, lean in the way frontier work made men lean, with a face that had been outdoors in all weather for enough years that it was hard to tell where expression ended and weathering began. He had a cut above his left ear that nobody had noticed in the dark, dried now, not serious. He looked at Caleb and then around the room. "Hartwell Place," he said. "That's right." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "I was at the north fence line when it hit. Should have turned back 2 hours earlier." He said it flatly, without self-pity, the tone of a man accounting for his own mistake honestly. "Rope on the fence post snapped and I lost the line back to the bunkhouse." How long were you out there?" "I don't know. Long enough." He looked at his hands. Vale's hands are spread across 3 fence lines. If the rope on mine snapped, the others might have... "We can't know that until the storm passes," Caleb said. And the storm hasn't passed. Morrison looked at the window. The wind was still running hard outside. Not what it had been at its worst. They'd come off the peak sometime in the small hours, but still enough that nobody was going anywhere voluntarily. How long? Few hours, maybe. It's backing off. Morrison put his feet on the floor and sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. Vale said this storm wouldn't be bad, he said, not accusatorially, just stating it. He said the ridge would break it. Caleb didn't say anything to that. He said the same thing every winter I've worked there. Ridge will break it. Ridge didn't break it this time. Morrison looked at him. Your windbreak. I followed it in. Found one of the outer berms in the white and kept my hand on it until I hit the fence line. That's how I found the rope line. Caleb absorbed this. The outer berm, the first element of the system, the one that was supposed to provide the first 20% reduction in force. In the actual event, it had also served as a navigation line for a man who would otherwise have died in the yard. You built that, Morrison said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Morrison looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went back to looking at his hands. Evelyn came in from the back of the house. She'd slept a few hours. Caleb had heard her insist on it, heard Ruth insist back that she do the same, heard the brief negotiation and its outcome. She looked at Morrison, took in his improved color and his upright position, and something in her shoulders released slightly. Mr. Morrison, she said. Mrs. Hartwell. He looked up at her. I'm sorry for the trouble. You're not trouble. You're a man who needed shelter. She poured herself coffee and stood at the counter. When the wind drops enough, we'll find out about your people on the other lines. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Caleb. He knew the question she was asking without her asking it. How much wind dropped before he could get outside and finish properly bracing the second deflector? 2 hours, he said. Maybe less. She nodded. The wind dropped in stages over the course of the morning, and each stage felt both like progress and like a smaller version of what had been. The storm reducing itself, but not yet willing to admit it was done. By 10 o'clock, the white had separated back into distinguishable elements: sky, ground, the shapes of buildings. Caleb could see the windbreak from the window. He stood there for a full minute just looking at it. The outer berms were intact. The first main deflector was standing clean. The smaller angled piece on the northwest corner, the one he'd finished on the morning the storm arrived, was holding. The second main deflector was still leaning at its 30-degree angle from where the post had pulled in the night. And even from the house he could see that the spike he'd driven had held it through the night, which it had not been built to do for a night of that duration. It's still up, Dell said from behind him. Mostly counts. Caleb went out to fix it properly as soon as the wind dropped enough to make work possible. Tom came with him and Marcus, and they worked the second deflector back to vertical while the storm gave them cold gray light and intermittent gusts that were still enough to make conversation difficult, but were no longer enough to stop work. The rebracing took 2 hours. He drove the footings deeper this time. Should have done it before. Should have found a way to get down to solid frozen ground instead of settling for the semi-frozen layer he'd worked with, and added 2 diagonal supports that the original design hadn't included. When it was done, it was better than it had been before the failure. That was the thing about fixing your own mistakes. You understood the failure in a way that made the repair stronger than the original. He stood back and looked at the full windbreak system in the flat post-storm light. Some of the facing on the outer berms had been damaged, boards pulled and splintered in the worst of the gusts. And there was visible stress cracking on one of the timber joints of the first main deflector. But it was standing. All of it was standing. The barn behind it was standing too. He walked to the main barn door and opened it, and was hit by the relative warmth inside. Not warm by any standard a human would find comfortable, but warm compared to the flat frozen air outside. Warm in the way that showed the structure had held its heat through the storm. The cattle were loud and unhappy, as cattle are after being confined through a serious blow, but they were all there. He counted them twice. Dell was behind him again. The man had a quality of appearing where things were happening without making a production of it. 62 head, Dell said. Same as before. Water? Trough's good. Not a fleck of ice. Caleb thought about the water trough in its new position, on the south wall in the sun, the timber frame around it, the trough that had been in the wrong place for 15 years, that had iced over every morning through every cold snap, that everyone had spent an hour every freezing day dealing with because it was where it was, and that was where it had always been. South wall worked, he said. South wall worked, Dell agreed. They stood in the barn in the smell of cattle and hay and the cold that was coming in around the door, and there was a quality to the silence between them that was different from the silence of the past weeks. Less provisional, like something that had been a question was now an answer, and both of them knew it. Mutz. The hay was the next to counting. He went through the storage that afternoon with Evelyn, both of them pulling samples from different sections, checking what the storm had done, whether the moisture levels had changed, whether the platform he'd built had held the stock above the ground through the temperature swings of the blizzard. The platform had held. The hay above it was clean. The compromised sections they'd identified before the storm, the bottom layers on the north wall that had already been going gray, had not gotten worse. He'd pulled the bad material out and burned it 10 days ago, and the good stock above the cleared-out section was dry and usable. Evelyn did the accounting in her head the way she did her ledger calculations, running the numbers quietly, and when she came to her conclusion, she stopped walking and stood still for a moment. "We have enough," she said. "Through the winter?" "Through winter and into early spring, if we're reasonable with rationing in February." She turned to look at him. "I thought we'd be short by February. I'd already started thinking about which animals to sell." The south sections were better protected than I expected. The platform helped more than I'd estimated. "Don't minimize it," she said. He looked at her. "I've had men work this ranch who spent a lot of energy minimizing their own successes," she said, "usually so they could claim later that they hadn't really promised anything. I'm telling you, the hay is adequate through winter. That's because of what you did. Don't shrink from it." He didn't know exactly what to do with that, so he just nodded and moved on to the next section. Morrison left on the second day after the storm, once the roads were passable enough to make the 7 miles to Vale's ranch reasonable. He borrowed a horse from Evelyn's string she offered without being asked, and he stood in the yard before leaving with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I'll return the horse when I can get back this way." "No hurry," she said. He looked at Caleb. Something moved in his face. Not comfortable, whatever it was, but he let it happen. "I was at the fence line when you started building that windbreak," he said. "Couple weeks ago. We could see it from the north boundary." He paused. "Vale said it wouldn't work. Said you were putting up a lot of timber that would fall down in the first real wind." "Some of it leaned," Caleb said. "Some of it leaned," Morrison agreed, "but the outer berm was standing when I found it in the white." He put his hat back on. "I'll tell him what I found, what I used to get in. He'll hear it from me straight." He rode out. Caleb watched him go and tried to think about what it meant and decided it didn't mean much yet. What Vale did with the information was Vale's business. What mattered was the 62 head of cattle in the barn and the adequate hay in the storage and the water that had flowed through the worst night of the winter without a fleck of ice. The neighboring ranchers started arriving on the third day after the storm. Not all at once, it was a trickle at first, men on horseback picking their way through the snow, coming to see what the valley looked like after the worst blizzard in a generation. Some of them had lost animals. 2 ranches south of Frost Creek had lost significant portions of their winter hay to a collapse of their storage structures under the snow load. One man, a rancher named Corbin, who ran a small operation along the creek, had lost his water system entirely. A pipe rupture that had flooded and then frozen the area around his main trough and well head, and now the whole apparatus was locked in 3 feet of ice. They came to the Hartwell place because word traveled, the way word always traveled in these valleys. And the word was that Frost Creek Ranch had come through with its animals alive, and its water running and its hay intact. The first time one of them asked to look at the windbreak, Caleb took him out and walked him through it. He explained the angle of the outer berms, the positioning of the deflectors, the way the system worked with the ridge's natural funnel instead of against it. The man, a weathered rancher named Briggs, who ran cattle on the east side of the valley, listened without saying much and asked a few practical questions about materials and labor. "You built this in 2 weeks?" Briggs said. 2.5. Briggs looked at the timber framing of the second main deflector, the new diagonal braces Caleb had added after the failure. This piece looks different from the others. It failed during the storm. I rebuilt it. Briggs looked at him. In the storm? Before the worst of it. Mostly. Briggs walked the length of the outer berm, pressing his boot against the base of each post. He did it the same way Dell had done it the first time he'd looked at the trough frame. Testing, not accepting. Caleb respected that. My water system, Briggs said finally. What you did with the trough here, moving it to the south wall, the timber frame around it, could that work for a setup like mine? Depends on your layout. I'd need to see it. Would you look at it? Caleb thought about Evelyn, about the ranch, about the 14 things still on his list. When things are settled here, he said. Yes. By the fourth day after the storm, there had been 6 visitors to Frost Creek Ranch asking similar questions. Caleb answered them all the same way. Walked them through the system, explained the reasoning, answered the practical questions, told them when he'd need to see their property before he could say what would work. He didn't think about what it meant that they were asking. He was too busy. The trouble came on the 5th day, and it came in the form of Gideon Vale riding into the yard in the late afternoon. Vale looked different from the last time Caleb had seen him. He was still in the good coat, still had the quality of authority that came from being the largest landowner in the valley, but something in his bearing had shifted in a way that was hard to name at first. He dismounted and handed his reins to Tom and stood in the yard looking at the windbreak for a long moment before he spoke to anyone. Evelyn came out to meet him, same as before, in the yard, on her ground, where she could see everything. Gideon, she said. Evelyn. He looked at the windbreak. Morrison told me what happened. I imagine he did. Vale was quiet for a moment. He walked a few steps toward the windbreak, stopped, looked at the outer berm. He put his hand on it the way everyone put their hand on things they were uncertain about, testing the reality of it. Caleb stayed where he was, near the barn, far enough away not to be part of the conversation unless he was invited into it. Vale turned and looked at him directly. He walked over. The second deflector failed in the storm, Vale said. It was not an accusation, more like an opening. The base post pulled from the footing on the soft side, Caleb said. I reseated it and added diagonal braces. It held through the rest of the night. Morrison said he followed the outer berm to get in. That's what he told me. Vale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground, which was unusual. Caleb had not yet seen him look at the ground when he was thinking. I lost 11 head, Vale said. Northeast pasture. The animals pushed through the fence when the wind hit from the wrong direction. By the time anyone found them, they drifted too far and the temperature had done the rest. Caleb said nothing. I also lost a portion of my hay storage. East wall collapsed under the snow load. He paused. Morrison's hands on the north fence line were all right. The rope held on the others. Another pause. He told me the outer berm was standing when he found it. Yes. Vale looked at the windbreak again. Then he looked at Caleb, and the appraisal that had been in his eyes the first day was still there, but it had recalibrated again, the way it had recalibrated when Caleb mentioned Halloran Valley. I've been in this valley 22 years, Vale said. I've told myself I knew its weather. Caleb waited. I was wrong about the ridge, Vale said. He said it the way a man says something he's practiced saying privately for a few days before saying it out loud. Not easily, but with the intention of being honest. I've been wrong about it for 22 years, and I never lost enough animals in a single storm to force me to admit it. This time I did. Caleb looked at him steadily. The ridge creates a funnel on the northwest side, he said. It's not immediately obvious. You'd have to look at the snow patterns over a number of storms to see it. Vale's expression shifted slightly. Caleb suspected the man had expected more satisfaction in that admission from him, and was uncertain how to respond to the absence of it. What would it take to build something like this at Vale Ranch? Vale asked. Caleb looked at the windbreak. I'd need to look at your layout. Your ridge exposure is different from this one. You're set back further from the main funnel, but you've got that long, flat approach from the northeast that gives the wind more velocity before it hits your buildings. That's what hit the east pasture, Vale said. From the northeast. I know. I saw your layout when I rode through that part of the valley 2 weeks ago. He paused. You'd need a different configuration than this one, probably a longer outer berm and a single main deflector positioned further out. Vale looked at him. You were thinking about my property 2 weeks ago. I was thinking about the wind in this valley, Caleb said. Your property is in this valley. Something in Vale's face shifted again. That recalibration, more significant this time. He was a man who was used to being the one with the complete picture, the full account, the position of most information. Finding someone who'd been carrying more information than him about something he considered his own territory was clearly an experience he was still processing. I'd like you to look at the Vale Ranch layout, Vale said, when you're free here. I have work to finish at Frost Creek first. Of course. Vale turned to go, then stopped. The banknote on this property, he said, still not looking at Caleb. The arrangement I have with Evelyn. I want you to know that I'm reconsidering the terms. Caleb looked at him carefully. That's between you and Mrs. Hartwell. I know it is. I'm telling you because you're part of why I'm reconsidering it. He turned then and looked at Caleb directly. Not as a favor, as a business matter. A ranch that survived this storm the way this one did is a better investment than I thought it was. He went back to his horse, spoke briefly to Evelyn, and rode out. Caleb stood in the yard and watched him go, and didn't entirely know what to make of it. That evening, after supper, after the children were settled, and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, Evelyn found him at the kitchen table with the diagrams again. Not the windbreak diagrams, but a new set, rougher, preliminary sketches of the hay storage improvements he still wanted to make before spring. She sat across from him. She had her account book, but she didn't open it. Vale spoke to me, she said. I figured he would. He's reducing the interest on the note, not eliminating it. He's not that changed, but reducing it. She folded her hands on the table. It means the ranch has room to breathe through spring. Caleb looked at his sketches. That matters, she said. More than I can easily say. It's good news. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. 6 ranchers have come through asking about your windbreak system. I know. Briggs wants you to look at his water setup. Corbin wants to know about hay storage. The Delacroix brothers east of town want a full assessment of their operation. He looked up. People talk, she said. When something works, people talk. This valley's been doing things the same way for 20 years, and in 3 weeks, one storm showed everyone what that was costing them. She paused. What you know, how to read a piece of land, how to find what's going to fail, there's real demand for that here. I have work to finish at this ranch, he said. I know you do. I'm not suggesting otherwise. She looked at him carefully. I'm suggesting that when that work is done, you'd have a choice about what comes next. He looked at her. She met his gaze directly, the way she always did. Frost Creek needs someone who can do what you do, she said. Not just this ranch, the whole valley. She was very careful about how she said the next part. There would be an arrangement if you wanted it. Work out of this ranch as a base. Fair terms. What kind of arrangement? A fair one? She said again. We can discuss specifics when you're ready to discuss them. He looked at his sketches. He thought about Wyatt's question. Are we going to stay here? He thought about what he'd said in return, which was that he wanted to finish what he started. That had been true when he said it, and it was still true, but he was beginning to understand that finishing what he'd started here was going to take longer than a season. He thought about the windbreak out there in the cold, standing in the post-storm dark, the second deflector braced properly now, the outer berms intact. He thought about what Dell had said, mostly counts. Let me get through the rest of what's on my list, he said. Then we'll talk. She nodded. 11 more things, she said. He looked up. You said 14. We've addressed 3. A brief pause. 11 remaining. He hadn't expected her to have kept count. He shouldn't have been surprised. 11, he confirmed. She stood up, picked up her account book, and then stopped. The cattle, she said. 62 head, all present, water running, hay adequate through early spring. She looked at him with that direct, measured look. My husband would have been furious about the trough and the hay storage and the barn direction, all the things he got wrong. He'd have had a hard time with all of it. She was quiet for a moment, but he would have recognized a man who understood the land. That was something he always valued, even when it came from a direction he didn't expect. She went toward the back of the house. Caleb sat at the table for a while after she'd gone, the sketches in front of him, the lamp throwing its uneven yellow light. Outside, the valley was cold and quiet, in the way it's quiet after a big storm. Not peaceful exactly, more like depleted, like the land had spent everything it had and needed time before it tried again. He thought about Lila asleep in the back room, and Wyatt, who had stopped jumping at loud noises sometime in the past 2 weeks without either of them noting when. He thought about the foreman's room that smelled like cedar and someone else's boots, that had started smelling just slightly like their things mixed in with those older smells. He picked up the pencil and went back to his sketches. There were 11 things still on the list. The visit that changed things came not from a rancher, but from the county inspector, a man named Aldous Ferris, who arrived at Frost Creek on the 8th day after the storm with 2 other men whose names Caleb didn't catch, and a general air of official purpose. Ferris was a precise, dry-voiced man in a coat that was too light for the weather, a man shaped by offices rather than outdoors. He walked the property with Evelyn, making notes, and he asked Caleb questions about the windbreak system in the tone of someone taking a deposition. "You constructed this in under 3 weeks," Ferris said. "It had the quality of a charge." 2.5, Caleb said, "without formal engineering credentials." "Without formal engineering credentials," Caleb agreed. Ferris wrote something down. "The county lost significant livestock in this storm. Several operations have filed reports. The question being asked at the county level is why some properties survived better than others." He looked at the windbreak. "This is one of the better outcomes in the valley." "I'm aware." "What I'd like to understand," Ferris said, clicking his pen, "is whether what you've done here can be replicated, whether it's a one-property solution or a valley-wide approach." Caleb looked at the windbreak, then at the ridge above the valley, then at the angle of the sun on the snow, lower every day now, the days shortening. "It can be adapted," he said. "Every property is different, but the principles are the same everywhere in this valley. The ridge funnel, the northwest exposure, the common mistakes with water and hay." He paused. "The problem is time. You need to know what you're building before the season turns, and most people don't start thinking about it until after the first bad storm. And if they had someone who could assess their properties before the season, then they could build for what's coming instead of repairing what broke." Ferris wrote more things down. He looked at Caleb with the careful look of a bureaucratic man deciding whether something is useful or dangerous. "The county might have an interest in formalizing something like that," he said. "An assessment service, working across the valley, someone with demonstrated knowledge." He looked around the ranch. "With a demonstrated record." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what Evelyn had said, the whole valley needing what he knew. He hadn't quite believed it when she said it. He believed it slightly more now. "Talk to Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said. "She'd be part of any arrangement that involves this ranch." Ferris nodded and went to find Evelyn. Dell materialized at Caleb's elbow. "County inspector," Dell said, with the particular tone of a man who has strong opinions about county inspectors. "He's not wrong about the need," Caleb said. "No, he's probably right about that." Dell watched Ferris walk toward the main house. "Funny how things go." Caleb looked at him. "Man shows up with a broken wagon," Dell said, not looking at him. "Broken wagon, 2 kids, nothing else." He paused. "County inspector comes to the ranch 8 days after the worst storm in 20 years, and he's not asking about the ranch owner. He's asking about the repairman." Caleb said nothing. "I'm not making a point," Dell said. "Just noting how things go sometimes." He walked off toward the barn, hands in his pockets. Caleb stood in the yard between the barn and the windbreak in the cold afternoon light, and looked at the property he'd spent 3 weeks trying to save. The barn behind its windbreak, the trough on the south wall, the hay storage with its raised platform, the east outbuilding wall, repaired. 10 more things on the list. 62 head of cattle. 1 county inspector walking toward the house to talk to a woman who had offered a drifter and his children a warm room and a plate of stew, and 1 chance to prove himself. The wind came off the ridge, lighter than it had been in weeks, but still present. Still the same wind that had been shaping this valley for longer than anyone had been living in it. Caleb felt it against his face and read it the way he read things. looking for what it meant, what it was going to do, what you needed to build to work with it instead of against it. 11 things still on the list. He went to find his tools. The 11 things took the rest of winter, not because Caleb was slow. Anyone who had watched him work over the past weeks would not have said slow, but because winter itself had opinions about the pace of work, and also because some of the 11 things turned out to be more complicated than they'd appeared on the list, and because 3 of them revealed additional problems underneath when he got into them. The way problems have a way of nesting inside each other when a property has been running on old methods for too long. The east outbuilding wall led to a foundation issue. The foundation issue required a week of work in frozen ground that cost him 2 cracked knuckles on his right hand this time, his left still not entirely healed from the roof nail. The drainage channel he rerouted on the south side of the barn revealed a buried timber that was rotted through and had been slowly compromising the soil structure under the corral. Not dangerous yet, but inside 2 more years it would have been. He pulled it out and replaced it with treated posts, and nobody made a fuss about it, which was how he preferred things to go. Dell helped when he could. Tom helped with the physical work that needed 2 sets of hands. Evelyn came out most mornings for at least an hour, checking progress, asking questions that were always practical and sometimes incisive in a way that made him think harder about what he was doing than he'd been thinking before she asked. The dynamic between them had shifted in the weeks since the storm in a way that was hard to describe precisely. It wasn't a softening, exactly. Evelyn didn't soften. That wasn't her character, and Caleb wasn't looking for that. It was more like the removal of a layer of evaluation. They had been assessing each other since the first night, and somewhere in the storm or immediately after it, the assessment had reached a conclusion, and that layer had simply dropped away, leaving something more direct underneath. They disagreed about things. She pushed back on 2 of the approaches he took with the remaining list items, and one time she was wrong, and he said so. And one time he was wrong, and she said so and was right, and both times the disagreement lasted about as long as it needed to and then was done. He was aware that he was comfortable here. He noticed it the way you notice something that used to be missing once it's present. Not dramatically, just with a kind of quiet recognition that took him by surprise when he examined it honestly. Wyatt stopped hiding food sometime in January. Caleb didn't notice when it happened. That was the thing. It wasn't a moment. It didn't announce itself. He simply became aware one morning that the small cache under the floorboard of the foreman's room, the one Wyatt had been maintaining since the first weeks of their traveling, was empty. He'd checked it periodically, not because he wanted to disturb it, but because it told him something about how his son was measuring their security. Empty. Not recently emptied. The dust pattern said it had been empty for a while. He didn't say anything to Wyatt about it. He just sat with it for a while. In the particular way that things about your children sit with you, the combination of relief and something that ached a little. Because the hiding had started when Margaret died, and the ending of it meant his son had made a decision, on his own, in the privacy of whatever 7-year-olds have that functions as inner life. Wyatt had decided that tomorrow was probably going to come and there would probably be food in it. Caleb went back to work. The conversation with Evelyn about the arrangement happened in February, on a Sunday when the snow was falling lightly and the work list was down to 4 items, and the ranch had the settled quality of a place that had been through the worst and knew it. She had papers on the table. Not the ledger, actual drafted papers, which meant she'd had Frost Creek's notary involved, which meant she'd been thinking about this for some time. "I want to be clear about what I'm proposing," she said, "because I've had arrangements go wrong before from people not being clear. All right? This ranch needs a permanent overseer of structures and systems, not a hand. Someone who thinks about the whole property, what it needs season to season, what's going to fail before it fails." She looked at the papers. "I can't pay what that position is worth in cash. What I can do is offer a partnership stake, 15% rising to 25 over 5 years if things go the way I think they can." Caleb looked at the papers. He didn't touch them yet. "There's also the county work," she continued. "Ferris came back last week. The county wants to formalize an assessment service for the valley. Someone who can evaluate properties before each winter season, make recommendations, oversee improvements. They're willing to pay a retainer." She paused. "It would operate out of this ranch. The tools, the base, the space. Half the retainer comes to the ranch, half to you." You've been busy, he said. I've been planning, she said, which was different, and she knew he understood the difference. He looked at the papers for a long moment. He thought about the road from 3 months ago. The broken wagon, the frozen mud, Lila asleep against his chest, Wyatt with the food sack. He thought about the arithmetic he'd been doing since Margaret died. The relentless small number arithmetic of a man with 2 children and no fixed place, counting what he had left against what was needed and finding the gap. The gap had closed. He wasn't entirely sure when. There's something I need to say first, he said. Evelyn waited. I'm not a man who's easy to live alongside, he said. I notice things wrong with everything, and I tend to say so. I have opinions about how things should be done, and sometimes those opinions are right, and sometimes they aren't, and it takes me longer than it should to tell the difference. He looked at her. And I have 2 children. That's not a temporary condition. I know it's not. Lila's going to need... He stopped and started again. She doesn't remember her mother. She will grow up not remembering her. What she'll remember is whatever is around her here. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I know that too, Caleb. The way she said his name, directly, without qualification, the way she'd said most things to him since about the 3rd week, made him look at her with more attention than he usually let himself use. She met the look without deflecting. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are, she said. And I'm not a simple woman to live alongside either, in case you hadn't noticed. He had noticed. I noticed on day 1, he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the topography of one. Then we understand each other. He picked up the papers. Chet. He signed them that afternoon, and they shook hands across the kitchen table, which was both slightly formal and exactly right, and Ruth brought coffee and set it down without comment, though her expression was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen and was satisfied that it finally had. The next morning, Caleb was back at the work list, and nothing about that changed. Spring came in stages the way it does in high valley country. Not a sudden warmth, but a series of negotiations between the cold and something less cold, ground that softened during the day and froze again at night, snow that pulled back from the south-facing slopes first and clung to the north-facing one stubbornly for another month. The creek that gave the ranch its name came off the mountain loud and gray with snowmelt, higher than Dell said he'd ever seen it in 20 years of watching. The work list reached 0 sometime in late March. Caleb stood in the yard on a morning that was still cold, but had the smell of something loosening in it, the smell of mud under ice, of bark wet with melt, and he looked at the ranch around him and tried to see it the way he'd seen it when he walked up the track that first afternoon. The barn, which had faced the wrong direction for 30 years, and still faced the wrong direction, but now had the windbreak standing between it and the northwest funnel. The trough on the south wall, ice-free through the worst winter in a generation. The hay storage with its raised platform, the east outbuilding with its repaired wall, the drainage channel rerouted, the buried timber replaced, the foundation shored, the fence lines retightened, the roof section that he'd climbed in a blizzard to nail back down, all of it standing. Not perfect. The windbreak had visible storm damage on the second outer berm that he'd repaired, but that still showed its history in the mismatched boarding. The east outbuilding wall was solid, but the new siding was a different color than the old, and always would be. There were things he'd done that he'd do differently if he did them again, and he knew which ones they were. But standing, Dell came to stand beside him, as Dell had a habit of doing. They looked at the ranch together for a moment. Briggs is ready for you to come look at his water system, Dell said. I know, I told him next week. And the Delacroix brothers. After Briggs, Dell was quiet for a moment. County wants an answer about the formal arrangement by the end of the month. They'll have it. Dell nodded. He looked at the windbreak, the second deflector with its added diagonal braces, the northwest corner that had gone up on the morning the storm arrived and had held. You planning to tear it down and rebuild it this spring? He asked. Do it right, with proper timber, before next winter. Caleb had been thinking about that. The berms need reinforcing. The first main deflector is sound. I'll leave it. The second one I want to rebuild from the footing up. I want to get into solid frozen ground before the thaw makes it complicated. He paused. And I want to extend the system 20 feet further on the northwest end. The corner held, but there was more stress there than I'd designed for. Dell looked at him. Rebuilding the part that worked. Rebuilding the part that worked well enough, Caleb said. There's a difference. Dell considered this. Most men, when something works, they leave it. Most men are not planning for the winter after next. Dell was quiet again. Then he said, "No," in the tone of a man confirming something he'd already suspected for a while. Briggs's water system took 3 days. The problem was more complicated than a simple trough repositioning. His property had a different topography, a natural cold sink that ran across the center of his working yard and collected frigid air like a bowl, and any water infrastructure placed in that zone was going to struggle regardless of where on the south wall you put a trough. The solution Caleb arrived at was less elegant than what he'd done at Frost Creek, a combination of repositioning the main trough, routing the feed line through an insulated channel, and redirecting a portion of the drainage so the cold sink didn't pool as deeply. 3 separate interventions where one would have been cleaner. Briggs watched him work and asked the same kind of questions Evelyn asked, practical, specific, not deferential. Caleb answered them straight. On the second day, Briggs said, "You ever think about taking on a formal apprentice? Someone you teach this to?" Caleb looked at him. "Why?" "Because you can't be in 3 places at once," Briggs said, "and this valley's got 30 properties that need what you know before next November." Caleb thought about that on the ride back to Frost Creek. He thought about it over the next few days while he wrote up the formal assessment report for the county, the language Ferris had asked for, describing in terms an office could understand what the windbreak system had done and what a valley-wide assessment program might accomplish. He found the writing harder than the building, not because he didn't know what to say, but because translating physical knowledge into words that captured the actual thing, rather than just describing it, was a different skill than he'd had occasion to practice much. Evelyn helped him with it. She sat across the table 3 evenings in a row and read what he'd written and told him where it was clear and where it wasn't, and she was right about both, and the final version was better than what he'd have arrived at alone. "You should teach this," she said on the 3rd evening. Not Briggs's line exactly. Less about apprentices, more about the knowledge itself. What you know about how land and weather work together, that's not common. It shouldn't stay in one person's head. "I'm one person," he said. "For now," she said, and left it there. He thought about it. He thought about Wyatt, who at 7 was already watching him work with the same focused attention Caleb had given to broken things since he was a child, asking the questions a person asks when they're not just curious but actually trying to understand the mechanism. He thought about how he'd learned what he knew, not from anyone who sat down to teach him, but from older men he'd worked alongside who explained what they were doing and why. Men who treated a question as an invitation rather than an interruption. He hadn't thought of that as teaching. Maybe it had been. Lila took her first real steps in April. She'd been moving along furniture and walls for a few weeks, which Caleb had been watching with the particular vigilance of a man who knew that the interval between almost walking and walking was short and unpredictable. He didn't want to miss it. He almost missed it anyway. He was at the work table in the barn, drawing up the windbreak rebuild plans, and Lila was in the yard with Ruth, and Ruth called out and he came to the barn door, and there she was, 4 steps across the yard, 5. Going for the fence post she'd decided was her destination, with the specific committed momentum of someone who has figured out the trick but hasn't yet figured out stopping. She reached the fence post and grabbed it and looked back at Caleb with an expression of total satisfaction. He sat down on the barn step. He wasn't expecting to feel it as hard as he did. He told himself that he'd accepted everything that had happened, the loss and the road and the 2 years of arithmetic and the absence that was always in the room whether or not he named it. He told himself he was past the worst of it, which was partly true. But watching his daughter walk across a yard toward a fence post on a spring morning at Frost Creek Ranch, he understood that past the worst of it and healed were different things, and healing was longer and less linear than he'd been calculating. Ruth looked at him from across the yard. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with the clear-eyed steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to know what she was seeing. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Lila let go of the fence post and sat down in the mud with the decisiveness of someone who has accomplished the goal and is now prepared to rest. And Caleb went to pick her up, and she grabbed his ear with both fists the way she did. And he stood there in the April mud of Frost Creek Ranch, holding his daughter, and let himself feel the full weight of the morning. Evelyn found him at the fence line an hour later. She didn't make a production of having seen what she'd seen, which he appreciated. She just came and stood beside him, looking out at the valley the way they both looked at things, directly, reading what was there. "The windbreak rebuild," she said. "Tom thinks you should start on the second deflector first, work outward." "Tom's right that the second deflector is the priority," Caleb said. "But I want to start with the outer berm on the northwest end because if the ground's going to be workable for deep footings, it'll be workable now and not later when it dries out." "So northwest first, then the second deflector." "Yes." She nodded. They looked at the ridge, still snow-capped, the morning light on it going from white to the dull gold color it took on in spring. Below the snow line, the timber was showing the first pale green of the season, the kind of green that's so tentative you're not sure it's there until it suddenly is everywhere. "Ferris confirmed the county arrangement this morning," she said. "Retainer starts in June." "I know, he sent a letter." "You didn't mention it." "I was going to." He paused. "I was also going to mention that Briggs asked if I'd look at the Corbin place when I'm done with the Delacroix brothers. The ice situation at the wellhead." "How long for Corbin?" 2 days, maybe 3. The pipe rupture left ice damage under the foundation of his storage building. It's more complicated than just the well." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be gone a lot," she said. "Not a complaint, an observation, but one with some weight in it." He turned and looked at her. She was still looking at the ridge. "I know," he said. "That's going to be a different arrangement than I planned for." "I know that too." She turned then and looked at him directly. There was something in her face that she was letting be visible. Not unguarded, that wasn't her way, but deliberate. The way she'd looked at him that night after the roof, the small shift in the careful ledger she kept. "We'll have to think about how it works," she said. "We will," he said. "We're good at thinking about how things work." The corner of her mouth moved in that way it moved sometimes. The almost smile that he'd stopped trying to predict and just watched for when it came. "We are," she said. "When we're not arguing about it. We don't argue that much. We argued for 45 minutes about the drainage channel." "You were wrong about the drainage channel." "I was wrong about that particular section," she said, with the precision of someone who had given this some thought. "I wasn't wrong about the slope coefficient." He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, and there was real amusement in it now, underneath the firmness. He closed his mouth. They stood in the April morning at the fence line, the valley spread out below the ridge with its grudging beginning green, the creek loud with snowmelt off to the east, the barn behind them with its windbreak standing in the new light. What Caleb had understood about broken things, from the time he was young enough to take them apart and try to put them back together, was this: the structure that fails is not always the weak one. Sometimes the thing that holds through the storm is the thing that already knows how to flex, how to redirect the force, how to absorb the worst of it without pretending the worst isn't happening. He'd spent his adult life working on buildings and barns and water systems, and the lesson was the same in all of them. You couldn't build a wall strong enough to stop everything. You had to be smarter than the thing trying to knock you down. You had to study its patterns, understand its angles, and then build something that worked with those angles instead of against them. He understood this about structures. He'd been slower to understand it about people, about himself, about the shape of a life after it's been broken and put back together in different conditions than it started in. You don't come through that kind of damage the same way you came in. You come through it reshaped, with new braces in places you didn't know you'd need them, with the marks of the repair visible if you know how to look. Margaret would have seen it immediately, because she'd seen everything immediately and had never been polite enough to pretend otherwise. He thought about that sometimes. What she would have made of Frost Creek, of Evelyn's kitchen, and Dell's wordless competence, and Ruth's nods, and the county inspector and the windbreak standing in the post-storm light. He thought she would have approved of most of it, and would have had pointed opinions about the rest, and would have told him so directly, which was one of the things he'd loved about her, and one of the things he still missed so specifically that it had its own shape. You don't stop missing people. That was another thing he'd learned in the last 2 years. You don't stop missing them, and the missing doesn't shrink. You just grow larger around it, so the ratio changes. He was larger than he'd been. He could feel it in the way he stood in a yard and read the wind coming off a ridge, the way he'd gotten quieter about what he was certain of, and less quiet about what he wanted. He was not a whole man yet, maybe. He wasn't sure what that would mean, or if it meant anything, or if whole was a thing that was achievable, or just a direction you could aim in. But he was closer to it than he'd been on the road outside of Frost Creek in November, with the broken wagon and the $6.40 and the cold coming. Wyatt understood this better than Caleb expected him to. Not in words. 7-year-olds don't usually have the vocabulary for it. But one evening in late April, when Caleb was at the table drawing up a preliminary assessment form that Ferris's office had asked him to create, a standardized way of recording what he found at each property so the county could track the data across the valley, Wyatt sat down beside him and looked at the papers with the usual focused interest. "What's that form for?" he asked. Caleb explained. The county arrangement, the assessment service, going to different ranches in the valley and looking at what needed to be fixed before winter came. Wyatt listened. Then, "So you'll teach other ranches what you taught this one?" "Something like that." Wyatt looked at the form. "Will we go with you?" Caleb looked at his son. "To the other ranches?" "Sometimes," Wyatt said. He wasn't asking to go everywhere, since the question was specific and practical, which was how Wyatt asked things. Just sometimes. Just to know the answer. "Sometimes," Caleb said. "Yes." Wyatt nodded. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. The windbreak rebuild took most of May. Caleb tore down the second main deflector completely and rebuilt it from the footing up, the way he'd said he would, getting into the solid layer below the seasonal freeze line, setting the posts in concrete that the general store in Frost Creek had started carrying since Briggs put in an order for his own water system repairs. The concrete was more expensive than the original timber footing, and Caleb paid for it out of the retainer advance Ferris's office had sent, which felt right. The new northwest extension went up in the third week of May, 20 feet further out than the original corner. The angle adjusted based on what the storm had shown him about the actual wind behavior at that end of the property. He'd spent a winter watching. He knew more about this specific piece of land and its specific relationship with the ridge above it than anyone had ever known, and he used all of it in the rebuild. When it was done, he walked the full system again. The outer berms, both main deflectors, the northwest corner, the angled closer piece. He pressed his hand to each post, tested each joint, checked each angle. The second main deflector was solid in a way the original had never been. The northwest corner was solid in a way it hadn't been when the storm hit. Dell did the same circuit behind him. He pressed his boot against the bases, the braces, the facing. He was thorough. "Better," Dell said. "Yes." "Different from the original." "Different and better," Caleb said, which was not the same as different instead of better, and both of them understood that. Evelyn came out and looked at the finished system in the late afternoon light. She walked the length of it without speaking, the way she'd walked the hay storage all those weeks ago, taking it in. When she reached the northwest extension, the new piece, the one built on what the storm had taught, she put her hand on the corner post and stood there for a moment. Then she looked back at him across the length of the windbreak. "It'll hold," she said. Not a question. Not the conditional evaluation of that first night, the if it's reasonable, and then we'll talk. Just a statement of what she could see. "It'll hold," he said. She came back and stood beside him. They looked at the windbreak together, and at the barn behind it, and at the ridge above the valley, still holding its last snow in the shadowed places where the sun didn't reach. A person standing in that yard on that May afternoon, watching the light move across the rebuilt windbreak, would not necessarily have understood everything that the structure represented. They'd have seen good timber work and solid footings and an intelligent layout that showed someone understood how this valley's wind moved. They'd have seen a job done right. They wouldn't have seen the broken wagon on the road outside of town. They wouldn't have seen the $6.40, or Wyatt with the food sack, or the arithmetic Caleb had been running for 2 years. They wouldn't have seen the failed footing in the blizzard, and the spike driven in the white dark, or the roof nail, or Dell materializing in the bunkhouse with his boots already on. But all of that was in the windbreak too, if you knew how to look. Everything that gets built is built from everything that happened before the building started. The failures are in there along with the good timber. The repairs show. That's not a flaw. That's the record. That's how you know the thing has been tested. Caleb looked at the ridge. He was already thinking about next winter, about the extended northwest corner and whether the angle was perfect or just close enough that he'd want to adjust it after a season of observation. About Briggs's water system, which he wanted to revisit in the fall before the ground froze. About the Corbin Foundation. About the form he was drafting for Ferris's office, and whether the county had the appetite to actually use it across the valley, or whether it would sit in a drawer. About the conversation he and Evelyn still needed to have, the one that wasn't about the ranch or the partnership stake or the county arrangement, but was about the other things that were true and that neither of them had said directly yet, not quite. About Wyatt in the mornings, reading the thermometer on the porch railing with the purposeful squint of a boy who is paying attention to how the world works. About Lila, walking now with increasing confidence across the yard and into the barn and back, her relationship with gravity still a negotiation, but a negotiation she was clearly winning. He thought about Margaret, as he did every day, in the way that had become less like an open wound and more like a compass, something he used to orient himself, to locate where he stood in relation to what mattered. And he thought about the road, the frozen dirt road, the wrong direction barn visible in the distance on a November afternoon, the cold smell of what was coming already in the air. He'd arrived with nothing, which was not quite true. He'd arrived with everything he had, which at that moment was not much, but was also exactly enough. He had arrived at a place that was falling apart, and he had understood, without anyone telling him, what it needed. That was the thing he'd carried his whole life. Not the tools, not the skills exactly, but the capacity to look at a broken thing and see, without flinching, both what was wrong and what was worth saving. That was what you brought to any place worth staying in, not the promise that nothing would break. Everything breaks. You brought the willingness to look at the breakage honestly, to fix what could be fixed, to rebuild the parts that failed better than they'd been built the first time, and to understand that the repairs were not a record of failure. They were a record of having stayed. Frost Creek Ranch was not a perfect operation. It had wrong direction barn it would likely always have, and a water trough that had been in the wrong place for 15 years before someone moved it, and a hay storage with a raised platform where there used to just be ground and hope. It had a windbreak with mismatched boarding on the second outer berm where the storm damage had been repaired with what was available, and a northwest corner extension that Caleb would probably adjust in the fall based on what he observed this summer. It had 62 head of cattle, all present, water that flowed through the worst night in a generation, hay enough through winter and into spring. It had Dell with his wordless competence, and Tom, who didn't need to be shown things twice, and Ruth, who had decided without announcing it that Wyatt and Lila were part of what she was responsible for. It had a 7-year-old boy who had stopped hiding food, and a 14-month-old girl who was crossing yards under her own power, and an account book that was in better shape than it had been in 2 winters. It had a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said, and had offered a stranger and his children a warm room and a plate of stew, and the truth that words meant nothing without results. The wind came off the ridge. Caleb felt it against his face, the same wind, the wind that had been shaping this valley and everything in it long before any of them arrived and would be shaping it long after. He read it the way he read everything, looking for what it was doing, what it intended, what you needed to understand about it in order to work with it instead of against it. He turned and went inside.